Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Foster-Foreman conference here at Penn State. Really appreciate everybody coming out. Such a big turnout. It's really nice to see. And my name's John Affleck. I'm the department head for journalism at Penn State. And it's my privilege tonight to get to moderate a discussion with Paul Pringle, who we are very excited to welcome back back to Penn State. Paul's Penn State alumnus. He got a master's degree here in journalism in the 1970s. He was a columnist for the Daily Collegian, and that's the reason we're having him back. Paul's been at he's had a career at several news organizations. He was at the Dallas Morning News for a while, but since 2001, he's been at the Los Angeles Times. And while he has been there, he has racked up just an incredible resume of great work. He's been a key part of teams that have won the Pulitzer Prize on 3 occasions. In 2004 for the coverage of wildfires in California, in 2011 for busting open corruption in a city called Bell, California, and really what we're here tonight to discuss is his latest work, or most recent work that won a Pulitzer. He was part of a team that unveiled a series of major scandals at the University of Southern California, including some real misdeeds in terms of drug use and which they call this with younger people by the dean of the medical school, Carmen Puliafito. And that led to another major break, one of the worst sex abuse scandals that we've seen in the country. George Tyndall, who is a gynecologist at the clinic there, had been abusing patients since the late 90s. That to date has resulted in USC settling with clients or patients of Tyndall's to the tune of $1 billion worth of fee. So that's Paul. He's written this book, Bad City, about this experience of writing these latest stories, Peril and Power in the City of Angels. The book also deals with the internal fight at the Los Angeles Times that it took to get the Puliafito stories published, which was not an easy thing. The editors sort of slow walked the process, and Paul's got a lot to say about that and what he went through in that area, and the book has done exceptionally well and has been called by the New York Times a masterclass in investigative journalism. So please put your hands together and welcome Paul back to Penn State.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. So we've got a room full of students here, some of whom have read the initial break on the story about Carmen, and some of whom have read more stories, some of whom have read pieces of the book. But let's just assume that we need to sort of catch everybody up on the general idea of your work and how you got here on this particular story. I'm not asking you about your path just yet. So,
Yeah, well, this happened with a tip. A tip came into the newsroom to one of our staff photographers from a whistleblower who had witnessed an overdose at a very nice hotel in Pasadena. The victim of the overdose was a very young woman. She was rushed to the hospital, and the room was registered to the dean of the medical school at USC. So this whistleblower, he was a manager at the hotel. He had to do this secretly because he'd be fired if he ever reported anything by a guest. That was sort of the policy of that hotel and others. So he did everything he could to get some attention to what happened to him. Because what initially happened is that he called 911, paramedics, even though the dean tried to stop him from doing that. He had a colleague call the police. So they came, they took the woman away, the police showed up, and absolutely nothing happened to the dean. Even though they found methamphetamine in the room, even though the woman, again, was rushed unconscious to the hospital, there wasn't even a police report filed. So this hotel manager with a conscience, he did, again, everything he could to bring this to light through regular channels. He filed a complaint with the city attorney's office. He called the office of the president at USC and told the two assistants there everything he witnessed, and absolutely nothing happened. He even tried to call us, and unfortunately, the Los Angeles Times, the person who answered the call said he would have to leave a voicemail, and he refused to do that because, again, he had to do this secretly. So just when he had given up, he just by coincidence ran into this staff photographer at a house party, and he expressed his frustration with what he had been through to try to get this story out, and the photographer brought it back to the newsroom, and then it came to me.
so when you've got a tip like that and you want to build it out, what are some of the steps you go through to get a story from, okay, that's an interesting tale, a provocative tale, and, involves criminal activity by a high-powered person. How do you move from there to, just in normal times, how do you move from there to having something that's in print that you feel confident about?
Well, it's usually quite a process. It's quite a process. In this case, I had some experience covering USC, and that's what that's what a tip came to me. But you get a tip like this, and 9 times out of 10 it doesn't pan out. It's just exaggerated. It's made up, or there's another side of the story that doesn't really make it news. And this one just seemed too good to be true. The dean of a medical school, the scene of an overdose, drugs in the room, no arrest, nothing. So the first thing I did, I spoke to the whistleblower over the phone, and I could tell that, and he was speaking to me confidentially. He was very precise in his details. He sounded very credible. I questioned him again and again, and I decided, yeah, there's got to be something here. So I didn't want to, broadcast this in any way. I'm not going to call, people around town first. I want to do this in person. So I went down to the police station in person, and I asked for the police report. I didn't know then that there wasn't one. And I really thought that as embarrassing as this story was going to be for USC, it would be a pretty simple story. It was a cop story. Cops showed up, paramedics showed up. There were, cop cars and fire trucks on the street, sirens wailing, lights flashing. How are you going to cover up something like that? I figured the cops would give me the basics, maybe not everything, and I'd be done with this in fairly, short order. I got the other treatment, the opposite treatment. They would tell me nothing, absolutely nothing. They gave me one record initially, and this was something called the call for service log, which was simply something that documented the fact that the cops accompanied the paramedics on a call. It was entirely redacted. There were no names that were of any use. No, it was a very, very brief narrative, the time of day this happened, that it did involve a drug overdose. What was key about that, though, is that it did match precisely the details of what the whistleblower told me. So I knew he was telling the truth about these key facts. So I took it from there, and what I encountered was an absolute cover-up at Pasadena City Hall. I mean, an old-fashioned just stone wall where they wouldn't give me anything. They wouldn't say anything about a police report. The police chief wouldn't give me an interview. The fire chief who's in charge of paramedics wouldn't give me an interview. It was crazy. And of course, I got the same treatment, maybe even worse, at USC. They wouldn't even acknowledge if I sent them an email that they received the email if I was asking for an interview. So I knew that this wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be a routine cop story. So what you do then is you just try to pick away at it. I filed a public records request under the California Public Records Act for things like if there is a police report, any emails that might have been generated inside City Hall about this incident, because I had my suspicions that there was a reason for the cover.
And now, are you working on it full time at this point? Or are you devoting some time to
I'm
it?
working on, well, that's the tricky thing, because of what's happened to our industry. We do a lot of things at once. I had 3 or 4 other investigations underway, so I couldn't devote my full effort to this. But I was pretty much on it. But again, I just kept encountering this wall of silence. So I finally was able to go out and door knock. I was looking for the cop who was on the scene, because again, City Hall wouldn't let me interview anybody. We knock on doors. At one point, there was just a couple of names on that call for service log, not of the victims or the perpetrators, but of the people who responded. I couldn't really find them. I did find one, and he wouldn't speak to me just by going to his house. So this went on for weeks, and the government can do this to you. Something this straightforward, they could drag it out. They simply don't cooperate. And none of this is normal. None of this is normal. This stuff was public record. They don't have to tell me everything. But when there's an overdose and the police respond and the paramedics, there needs to be a record of that. Now, I didn't even know she lived. So one of my first stops was the coroner's office. I said, and I should back up. We only had a description of the woman. Again, not her name. We knew what she looked like from the whistleblower, the witness, and we knew her first name was Sarah. So the other thing I'm doing at this time is I'm scrubbing records and social media, looking for anybody named Sarah who might be associated with the dean, whose name was Carmen Pugliafito. Pugliafito is a fairly uncommon name. Sarah, of course, is fairly uncommon name. Sarah is extremely common. So I wasn't having any luck. I'd find a bunch of Sarahs, but they'd be 50 years old, not in their early 20s. They'd be the wrong, race. They had I was just getting nowhere with that, just the way it is. But, young people don't leave much of a digital footprint by that age. So I'm doing all that. I'm knocking on doors. I'm trying to get some of the people inside City Hall to cooperate confidentially. And then eventually I got enough to confront the police chief with another public records request. And he kind of outsmarted himself and said he couldn't give me certain records because it was a matter of an investigation. And some, agencies will argue that if something's under investigation, they can't give you sheriff. So my response was, well, where's the report? You can't have a police investigation without a police report. And then they realized I had them, so they retroactively created the police report 3 months after the incident. And they still kept it from me. It took me another 2 months to get it, and that's because I was able to pressure somebody behind the scenes in the city leadership to make them cough it up.
It's an amazing level of stonewalling, and I think that if I were 21 and just starting out in journalism, I would be very discouraged by this story to this point. And
I was a lot older than 21, and I was very
and feeling like, okay, well, and we've all been through it where as journalists, where like somebody comes back, they're like, well, they won't talk, and the story that stonewalling essentially worked, and you move on and that sort of thing. What drove you to continue, and what broke it for you? Like what started to break it for you?
What drove me is just absolute outrage. I mean, this just is not supposed to happen. USC is an extremely important and powerful institution in Los Angeles. It's got its tentacles everywhere. The dean of the medical school is one of the most important and powerful people at the university. And here they were involved in obviously a crime. He was involved in a crime. It wasn't just an overdose. Again, they found drugs at the scene. I learned later that the dean lied to the cops about his relationship with the young woman. And then you layer on top of that the fact that the police are assisting in this kind of cover-up, assisting the university, which was telling me nothing. So you just can't walk away from that. You got to do everything you can to try to crack that silence. So Once they realized that they stumbled in denying my records request by claiming it was an investigation, they had to create that report. And once they created that report, sooner or later they had to give it to me. And now they're really feeling the heat because I'm not going away. I'm constantly on. By this time, I am basically full time on this. And so they finally gave me the report, and it was again heavily redacted, but it did have the dean's name on it as a witness. A witness. And he's a witness because he's in the same room. So he's in the same room with the drugs and the unconscious young woman. So what happened? There's still no arrests, nothing like this. So next I go after the 911 recordings. And that took some doing. And again, it took pressure. They should have given it to me when I asked for them, but they wouldn't. So it took some behind the scenes pressure. And when I finally got them, his voice was on the 911 recordings. He was there in the room. He was lying about what happened. He said the young woman just had drinks, but he had a very distinctive voice. You know, I pulled his voice offline from several things. So now I knew I had him there at the scene. I could prove that. And to me, that was enough for a story in and of itself. In the meantime, USC was so confident that they would get away with this cover-up that, again, more than 2 months after the overdose, USA knows that I'm investigating. They know that I'm knocking on doors all over town. They gave a public celebration for this dean, because in the meantime, he stepped down as the dean. You know, he stayed on the faculty. He continued to treat patients.
Let me just hold up on the timeline for 1 second. So the incident actually happens when
March
March
2016.
2016, and so now between then and before graduation, when normally someone would step down if they're going to step down,
Right.
they do a celebration of him when he steps down.
What first happened? No, that was actually worse than that. What happened first is, and again, this, as I peeled off layers of the onion, I learned why certain things did happen later. But 3 weeks after the overdose, so we're still in March.
Yeah.
Happened in early March. He just steps down as dean for what he said was a wonderful opportunity in biomed. He stepped down as the dean of this major medical school on a Thursday in the middle of the term immediately. That doesn't look right. And the really bad thing is that the university backed him up on this publicly. You know, sent out a statement to the university community, which of course I got, saying this is why he's leaving. It's sort of a positive. Of course, I learned later that he was forced out of the job because of everything that was happening with him and this circle of young people. We later learned he was avoiding them. So then it was after that, and they know that I'm investigating, that they had this public celebration at the medical school. And they sung his praises. The president was there, the provost, his successor as the dean. It went on and on. I learned about it from an insider, and I went there and I filmed it. I wasn't invited. Journalists have to be very careful about trespassing. It's a private medical school, so I stood on the sidewalk and filmed it with my camera. It was a very strange event because I knew that a lot of those people in attendance, all these doctors and professors and researchers, had to know something was up, but they couldn't say a word.
So kind of again, we get back. So now we're a few months out. You found out all this information. What else happens that completes the reporting for you? Do you find Sarah?
No, I still could not find Sarah. And I learned later it's because she was in rehab. Again, I just didn't have her last name. But what I did have was enough to publish the first story. I now have them at the scene. I have his voice in a 911 report. I have this, what they call an evidence of property report that I had to claw out of the police department that does confirm that the drugs were found in his room. I have an address for the quote owner of the drugs that's very similar to one of the addresses I found for the dean. So all of this, do I have proof that he provided drugs to her? No, but I have all these circumstances that definitely warrant public disclosure. And then I did other things. I interviewed experts on what should have happened. The fact, of course, a police report should have been filed. I got into that. I did have statements from the police department spokesperson who did acknowledge, again, once I had the records, that we found these drugs. Those were the drugs she overdosed on. I did confirm that the woman was still alive, just because her description didn't match any of the dead people who had died during that period, ended up in the coroner's office during that period. So I wrote a story. And as an investigative reporter, you can approach investigations a couple of different ways. One is to do the big story that takes many months or a year, and you do everything at once. You have all the answers, or nearly all the answers, and you lay it all out at once. That's not always possible on a story like this, because the whole time I'm knocking on doors and making phone calls and sending emails, I got to worry about the competition. The Pasadena papers might find out about this. The USC student paper might find out. And it's a great story to all of them. So I need to get something into print as soon as possible. So I took what we call the run and gun approach. That's where you get that first good story, you publish it, and you know when it lands, it's going to lead to more tips. More people are going to come forward. I learned later that, if that first story had run, I would have heard from people, like the young woman and her family. But then something happened. My top editor killed the story.
Why would he do that?
Well, I don't know, but it was all ready to go. We had the 911 recording to go with it. We had photos, plenty of background. It was like a nice package. Again, it wasn't a hugely long story, but it was a complete story. It raised a lot of questions that we couldn't answer yet, but that's what we do. We raise questions. So it was approved for publication by the city editor, who was my direct editor, the California editor, the managing editor, and the page one editor. And at the last minute, the editor-in-chief said he wanted to sleep on it, whether he was going to publish it or not, which stunned me. Although it shouldn't stun me, because when I first mentioned to him that I was working on this, he was not very enthusiastic, just the opposite. He said I should be working on something else, something that would put people in jail. My response was, this would put someone in jail. So now I have to think about the relationship between USC and the Los Angeles Times. It is a close one. In many ways, that's a very positive thing. The newsroom is filled with USC grads. A number of our reporters and editors teach part-time at USC. The two institutions sort of grew up together in LA. But USC is still an institution we cover, and we're supposed to cover it dispassionately and at a clinical difference and with no favoritism. But, I get a bad feeling about that. And at this time, the LA Times is in dire financial straits. We have terrible ownership. There are lots of layoffs. USC is going in the opposite direction. It's expanding, it's hiring people. A lot of people who are leaving the LA Times because there's no future there are going to work at USC. So it was really a strange situation. So I had to worry about that. We also had a big book festival that we put on together. It was it's the LA Times Book Festival. It's on USC's campus. I think it's the biggest book festival in the country. And the top editors are, at least the top editor is involved in that. So anyway, he calls us into a meeting the Thursday before the story was supposed to run. And he told me he's just not going to publish the story. And I just went into a rage. My editor was with me, the city editor. He was the calmer one there. And we demanded to know why. And at first he wouldn't say anything. He would just say that I should be grateful for his support over the years, for the work I've done, and kind of move on. Well, no. I insisted that this story needs to be published. So then we pressed him, what would it take to get this story published? And I should back up and say, when a story like this comes in, when you get that first tip, you start breaking the ice, the top editor is usually thrilled to hear about this. They can't wait for you to get the story published. They ask you if you need help. You need more reporters on. What can we do? Just the opposite happened here.
In the interest of time and letting students talk to us, we'll move the timeline ahead a little bit and just basically summarize that. So you set up your own team. You guys started your own team to continue, sort of like the cop movie where we're taking you off the case, and the detective keeps working on it. The reporters kept working on the story.
Yeah, what happened was he said, well, I'm not going to close the door to further reporting, which is not exactly a ringing endorsement of what you're doing. The message we left that meeting with was that this story was not going to be published unless we came up with something that made it absolutely unkillable. So the city editor and I put together a secret team of reporters to kind of flood the zone, to try to get anything that would make the story unkillable. So we added 4 more reporters to the team, and we did this in secret from our own bosses, which is never supposed to happen in a newsroom, and probably many other places. And we fanned out across LA. Our first instinct was to knock on the doors of USC administrators to see if they could give us some information proving that the dean lost his deanship because of the overdose. Now, he was still on faculty, and he's still treating patients. And as we learned later, he's still abusing drugs significantly. So we did that. We had no luck finding anybody who would talk. But in the meantime, I finally found the young woman. We got lucky. Her name came up on a LexisNexis search. Well, a Sarah Warren came up, associated with the address, one of the addresses tied to the deed. Go on social media, and I looked for a Sarah Warren who would match that description. After a couple of misses, I finally found one that the whistleblower, the witness, said, yeah, that's her. So now we have the name of the young woman. And from there, I found her family. She ended up in rehab. So now we were gathering more and more material. I eventually persuaded the family to, Sarah to go on the record. Once I got to it for her parents, and they turned over to me hundreds of images, photos and videos of the dean doing drugs and having sex with not just Sarah Warren, but this whole circle of young criminals and drug addicts. So this stuff was explosive. And now the story is unkillable, at least we thought. And then we filed a much bigger story with all this material, and the editors knew now. And number one, when they found out about the secret reporting team, they pressured the California editor to disband it. We ignored them. They said he told us to go back to our regular, duties, and we just decided, well, we'll do that so we don't get fired, but we're going to continue to pursue the USC story, and we did. We did it in secret until we came up with another draft that included all this new material, everything on the record, photos and videos. So now it's got to be published like within a week, 2 weeks. So this is when the top editors went into what I call delay and delete mode.
Okay. So they cutting bits out of the story.
Yeah, the first thing they did was just kind of sit on it for week after week. We're now in March, late March.
So we are now a year past
The overdose.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's all along the way. It can be tempting to move on to something else.
And you were ready to publish 3 months after the overdose with the initial story.
The initial story was more than, because remember, I had the initial cover up by the police department.
Right.
I was ready to publish in October or November.
Okay. So
that would have been more than
5-6 months.
Right.
5.
Yeah.
So this continues. What breaks the logjam and gets the story into print?
Well, again, the reporters, we would just not stand down. We kept pressuring the top editors to get this into the paper. They tried a number of things. They tried to take the whistleblower out of the story at one point. And again, that was so crucial because he made those calls to the president's office. So now we're tying the knowledge of the overdose to the president of the university. We threatened to go public and take other measures if the editors didn't put the whistleblower back in. The editors did. So again, everything was a battle. The newsroom attorney signed off on the second story in early May. It's still not being published. Eventually I decided to, and we complained repeatedly. I remember I was interviewing ethicists about the dean and how terrible his behavior was. And the ethicist told me that, well, what about the LA Times? Why aren't they going public with what they have now? This guy's putting people's lives in danger. He's getting young people, hooked on drugs. He was delivering drugs to Sarah when she was in rehab. He did that several times. He got her 17-year-old brother hooked on methamphetamine, and he's performing delicate eye surgeries during this entire period when he's abusing meth and heroin. And we're not publishing the story. That's just outrageous. So eventually I decided to go to corporate and complain about it. And I did. And that led to another secret investigation of the top editors. And that went on for a few weeks. In the meantime, our attorney told the top editor that if he didn't publish this story, it was going to be bad for the paper and for him personally. And finally, that got him moved. and the story was published, but not before, at the very last minute. The top editors went into the story and took out the most damaging material to the dean of USC, and that's the material that he was trafficking in drugs, including to the minor and including Sarah in rehab. That's much different than abusing drugs yourself, of course, especially when you're a physician. And of course, I pitched a fit over that, and they wouldn't back down. The story ran. I think they thought the story would have a short lifespan.
But it exploded.
It exploded. It became the biggest story of the year for us. It picked up all over the world, and now they were in a tough spot. Now they had to get behind the story all the way. So we started to publish more and more stories, but that corporate investigation, the HR investigation, was also going on, and in short order, that led to them being fired.
So let's get back to so that resolves the situation more or less.
More or less. We had some other hurdles to get
Adventures,
over.
but
Right.
Um, I should also, in the interest of fairness, say that the editors in question deny that they acted improperly to this day. They have taken a defensive position. They don't like your new book, which details this. They have not sued.
They threatened to sue.
They threatened to sue, but have not. And so that's where that is. But getting to the nitty-gritty journalism piece, the work on the dean shakes loose another story, and I just want you to.
Right. That's how these things happen. You publish a story like this, as I said earlier, and then people start coming forward. They had, that the story of the dean wounded USC and its president and his inner circle. I mean, there was public outrage about this. So USC was a very locked down place. I couldn't get faculty members to speak to me on the record, sometimes not even off the record. The president had a real, stranglehold on the faculty and the staff. Well, now he's weakened, so people are feeling a little bit more courageous about contacting journalists, the LA Times. So my colleague Harriet Ryan got another tip over the phone, fairly vague, but that there's a second bad doctor on campus. And that bad doctor turned out to be the campus gynecologist, who we later learned through our investigation had been allegedly, he's still awaiting trial, but the evidence we put together was quite compelling. He'd been allegedly abusing his female patients for 30 years. And people complained about it repeatedly, and the university did nothing about it. So that story landed. The editors who got in the way of the Polio story, they are now fired. They are out of the way. So we do this story, and it's at least as hard hitting as Polio story, if not more.
Right.
That's accusing this guy of crimes. It's certainly just as legally risky. So instead of it taking months and months to get published, with our new editor, this one took 3 weeks. And it led to the president of the university stepping down, his entire inner circle leaving, and then down the road, the $1.1 billion in settlements.
It also, I should say, is the story that won the team the Pulitzer Prize.
Yes, and we won the Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting.
So, that's a lot.
It's a lot.
Take a breath. I'm going to just ask a couple of questions, and then I want to open it up to people who are curious about this, any aspect of it. I want to ask a couple of things. I think living in the age that we do with social media and severe backlash, if you take a stand and if you stand up for yourself sometimes and that sort of thing, there's a real fear that comes with speaking out about something that you might inside you think is wrong, or doing something about something you think is wrong. What gives your sources why do your sources come forward? Why does anybody talk to the investigative team at the LA Times?
Yeah, and I mentioned this in Bad City, that in my experience, in the vast majority of cases, people put themselves on the line. They risk their jobs, their reputation, sometimes even their physical safety, in coming forward just because they want to do the right thing. There's no money in it for them. There's nothing but risk. But they are offended, they're outraged, they have a sense of justice, and they often have tried everything else, just like in the Filipino case and the Tyndall case. They complained internally. In the Filipino case, they called the police. They went to the city attorney. They went to the university, and they were turned away each time. So we become the last resort, investigative reporters, quite often. And it's because they have that moral, not just the moral outrage, but the moral courage to come at us that these stories finally get published.
This is getting into your background a little bit, but how do you, I should say, and you can describe it for us, but your career hasn't always been about investigations. So how do you develop the instinct to know that this is something that's really abnormal? This is something that really needs to be looked at. This is something that I will not give up until we have got this story out to the public.
Yeah, for most of my career, I was a general assignment writer. I was bureau chief for many years. I wrote a mix of, breaking news stories. I covered all the big trials, the earthquakes, the wildfires, and then feature writing. I would write about Oscar parties and just goofy things. I just like to write. But as time went on and our industry shrank more and more, and the ranks of investigative reporters shrank along with that, it just became apparent to me and others that this is where we have to focus our efforts on in the future, more and more investigative reporting. And by that time, I had developed, just by covering so many different things, you develop those instincts that when a story is a story, and one that really has to be published no matter what. And these were certainly in that category. But on the secret team, there were 3 people in their 20s. Yeah, they were all in their 20s when they started, I believe. And then another woman who was in her early 40s. Those 20-somethings, one guy had only been at the paper for 7 months, and no jobs out there. He had a baby, he had bills to pay, and the other 2 were just at the beginning of their careers, and they put it on the line too. They could have gotten fired. We were operating in defiance of our bosses, and when my editor and I asked them to join, and I made a point of asking 2 USC grads to join the team, and they did. They did not hesitate. And if they said, no, I don't want any part of this. I mean, the bosses don't want this done. You're at war with the bosses. Why do I want to get involved in this? They did not hesitate. They did not ask a single question. They just said, count me. And they put it all on the line.
Let's open it up. Who's got a question? I want to introduce yourself.
I know team podcast journalism major here. So obviously you met a lot of help. Like obviously you've been publishing the story because of the potential it had to essentially take down a lot of people in power, whether at the LA Times or USC. When crafting the story, how do you make sure everything's right with that? You cover all bases so that the story can live up to the potential that it has.
The question is basically, how do you, when you're working on the story with all of the moving parts, how do you keep it how do you make sure it's airtight so it's as impactful as possible?
It's the most important thing we do. And I would joke that the worst day of my life was whatever day my investigative story is going online. Because what if I miss something? It's over. We can't make mistakes. So we have a very elaborate fact-checking process. Unlike the government can win a case by proving something beyond a reasonable doubt, which means we got very close to the absolute truth. We don't even have that wiggle. Everything in the story has to be absolutely correct. If we get a street name wrong, someone can look at that story, but they can't even get the name of the street right. Why should we believe any of this other stuff? That's so outrageous. So the fact checking can take a very long time. And my method is to take a story like this, yellow highlighter, and I'll highlight every noun and number in the story. And we'll go through and put a slash through it when I have verified that with at least one thing in writing. Could be really should have been verified. It's usually documents. And there are a lot of facts. These stories are meant to read fairly quickly, so they don't bore you. When you take a story like this, you're talking about hundreds of facts. And you got to do that. And if you don't do it, it's going to come back to haunt you. And it's going to give the people you're targeting a lot of ammunition.
Who else has a question? In the back.
Me?
Yep.
Okay, so like going up against your editor-in-chief like that, how did that shape you as a journalist, and like what was that experience like?
It was a very stressful experience. I think because I had been shaped as a journalist by that point is why I did it. I wasn't going to let that happen. Neither were the rest of us. We were all in this together. There were 7 members of the reporting and editing team who took these steps. So, but it was very, very stressful. I was angry every day I worked on this story. I went home angry. I arrived at work angry. My family suffered for that. But what's the alternative? They were counting on the alternative, I think. But I would just say, it's just not worth it. Let's move on. But I had a tremendous support among the staff in the newsroom. Tremendous support. I made sure other people knew what was happening. So it became, we just could not let this go.
Can you contrast that with how you feel now going to work?
Oh, the LA Times has completely changed. Now we have new owners, new editors. I mean, now it works the way it used to work. That first story would have been published within a few days if I filed it today. I mentioned the Tyndall story was published within 3 weeks. That's the norm today. And it was before this was a blip in the LA Times history. We fell into the wrong hands, ownership-wise, and we just were run by people who didn't have the best interests of the newspaper at heart. A small number of people, and that started at the corporate level. So it was just a bad patch that we had to get through. And we didn't know we'd get through it. We didn't know that this would happen. We didn't know if we would get a new owner. The owners that we eventually got rid of, they intended to bleed the paper dry and eventually just sell it at some fire sale price, and it wouldn't be the Los Angeles Times anymore. So in the meantime, we formed a union, which was very important. We joined the News Guild. And I made sure I had helped form a union very early in my career when I was in my early 20s. The first paper I worked at, a small paper. This union campaign was started by staffers at the LA Times in their 20s. And they came to me because they heard that I had experience in organizing unions, so we're kind of a mismatch. But we did manage with a growing number of other folks on the staff to form a guild, a news guild. Now, I did this not for money. Everybody needed more money and lots of other things. I did it because I wanted union protections when it came to ethics. So under our current union contract, if a top editor tried to keep a story like this out of the paper, I have a means to fight that and go public with it. I can't be fined. So that's a little speech on behalf of the news guild.
Okay. I was once a member of the Wire Service Guild, in Blue Sweater, and then catching you and bringing back.
So you had mentioned that part of the reason that you initially started on this was that you had experience working on covering USC. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit on, I guess, kind of the quirks of covering like universities, academia, as opposed to, say, labor unions like you were in 2008.
Yeah, it comes down to whether it's a public or private university. And we have trouble with a lot of them. We have trouble with UCLA too, and that's a public university. And UCLA is subject to public disclosure laws. We can get their emails. We can get their financial records. With USC is a private school, we can get virtually nothing. Now, a school, and again, when I talk about USC, I'm talking about the upper leadership, the top leadership. I'm not talking about the people in the classrooms. The teachers, the students, of course, folks in the lab. This is about bad management. And they gave us, now, good management at a private university will be transparent, and they will give you this information if there's legitimate public interest in it. USC was just the opposite. So it was always difficult covering you. It was more difficult than covering labor. And they weren't exactly forthcoming either. More difficult than covering the government. With the government, including Pasadena, because I had the law behind me, the Public Records Act, I was eventually able to get something. These reports, 911 calls, USC never gave us anything. It was only after the stories ran that they started putting out public statements. So, don't have a good answer for you. I mean, it's just really tough. But it does bring me to this. Nowadays it's so easy to get records when they're available online. It's so easy to get so much information online. It's made my life a lot easier. But the best stories still come from people, from human sources, because on any kind of investigative story that's going to target somebody in power, you're going to hit roadblocks. You're going to hit that stone wall, and you need somebody, a person on the inside to help you. And I've always had great sources at USC. They're the ones that enabled me to break these log jams.
Okay, so you talked about the obstacles you faced in releasing this original story and throughout the process. Now that your book's been released, I see that some of your former colleagues and editors are speaking out against it. Matthew Doig of The Medium has called you fabulous
Fabulous, correct.
and said that you're grossly misrepresenting the facts to support your false narrative. How do you respond to these allegations and kind of the backlash?
They're lies. That's the short answer. These guys got, they got run out of the paper because of what they did. The book is not good for them. They're trying to, rehab their reputations. So I'm the target of that. They say I made it all up. And they're also attacking my colleagues, if not directly, then by extension. So I knew it was going to happen. They've gotten a platform here and there from, some of their buddies or cronies, but not a single word in the book will ever change because of what these 3 fired editors are saying.
Another question?
I was just wondering, what about the whistleblower made you believe that they were credible? And did you ever find out what the whistleblower's relationship was to the dean?
He had no relationship. He was the reservations manager at the hotel when it happened. And I go into all this detail in the book. So he has a very compelling personal story himself. If you read the book, I think you'll agree with that. He's just an honorable person. But again, most of the tips we get, like especially if they're really outrageous like this, they don't really lead anywhere. It's somebody's imagination, or someone's putting 2 and 2 together and getting 5. But he was very exacting in his details. He was very calm when I spoke to him. He had followed all of the usual steps you're supposed to follow. He did the good citizenship, good citizen stuff, and he got nowhere. So you get when you've done this for a while, you get a sense of that. You become sort of a human lie detector. And but again, he could be good at lying to me, or he had some acts of lying that somehow motivated him. But when I got that first piece of paper, that call to service log, again, the times of day and these other tiny details, they didn't add up on their own to a story, but they verified everything he told me to a T.
In terms of investigative reporting, and you guys had a secret group of 3 to 4 researchers, how do you split up the work? Is there one person, like a head honcho, that's giving out the work like you started the original story? Were you giving out work that you wanted to have research into, or did you come together as more of a group and decide where to go and split the work up amongst each other?
Yeah, it was the last that we started off, right from the get-go, to be collaborative, to consult with each other. What should we do it? The stuff we had to break up. Well, again, we had that initial task to try to find somebody who would talk, and that was labor intensive because you don't go to the place of work. People won't speak there. You go to their house. And by the way, the managing editor tried to stop me from going to the house of the USC president before the first story was even killed. That told me something was up. An editor is supposed to tell you, why don't you go to the house of the subject of the story? That's journalism 101. And he tried to stop me from doing that, and I did it anyway. So anyway, we tried that, and now when I finally found Sarah and the family, now we had all these avenues to pursue. We found her police records, so why did that work out? I would go to the Pasadena courthouse. The other reporters would go to other courthouses scattered around LA. So she had a very long, criminal record for someone that age anyway. So we got to get all those documents, and those documents contain other names of people she's associated with. So then we got to get the reports on them. So you basically build these sort of, documentary profiles of these people. And that, again, that's shoe leather. It's a lot of not everything is online.
That's a lot of time.
A lot of time, yeah, and that's why it helped. That's why my editor and I decided to put 4 more people on. We wanted to get whatever's out there as quickly as possible.
Let me just ask, setting aside the LA Times newsroom, Civil War, how do you know when it's done? How do you know when a story is done at this, on this kind of a project?
On this type of thing, again, that could be instinctive, but you know what's done when the information you have has answered all the major questions. This was the big story where we had people on the record, and we had all this supporting material. These documents we were just discussing, the court records. We went on social media. Younger people were better at that than I was. I have one little anecdote where one of the younger USC grads found that the dean was a Venmo friend of a major heroin dealer. Well, maybe he wasn't major, but he was the heroin dealer in this circle who was then in jail. At that point, I didn't even know what Venmo was. So that was a big help. So when you had, all the major questions are answered. What isn't answered? Things like motivation. Why would the dean do this? I mean, we have the simplistic answers, and often they're the truth. Because they're not cooperating. We didn't have, the answers of why USC decided to cover up. We had our suspicions, but we certainly, when you have enough that you gotta publish the story. And again, we had a moral imperative here. This guy was hurting people, and we knew about it. We're a newspaper. But somebody is hurting people, and you have the goods, you gotta publish it as soon as possible. You're not reckless. We weren't reckless. All this stuff was approved by the newsroom attorney after very thorough reviews. So, yeah, And again, the other alternative is you're going to go with what you've got because it's solid, and it's going to lead to more.
Okay. I learned over the summer about the concept of editing your editor, and you kind of got into that with the editor-reporter relationship that you talked about through this investigation. What's your best advice for young journalists that are going to these newspapers and they're experiencing this kind of stuff? I mean, kind of got your answer from pushing the story for what you think is right, but what's your best advice?
Sure. Well, number one, I've had, this was an anomaly. I've had great editors throughout my career. My editor today is a great editor. And he works with other great editors. But if, now and then you're going to get one who's not doing the right thing. And it's almost sounds flippant to say you can't stand out. You got to fight. And it's always easier to say that than to do it because your jobs could be on the line.
I'm just gonna say I've been involved in a bunch of investigative stories during my time at the AP, not to this level, but every story that ever really mattered involved a fight in the newsroom. People care passionately in the newsroom about really dumb stuff, and they care even more about stuff that matters. So it is part of the business, and in a way, I'm really glad that we're having that discussion because I don't think it necessarily works its way into the classroom because we're so busy telling you about skills, but interpersonal stuff really is, it's part of the game. It's part of what happens. Your Giants jersey.
Did you have a moment where you said this is Watergate, this is a Watergate type situation, or where this would lead to a Pulitzer Prize? Did you have that kind of reflection?
On this story and our first story on Pugliafito before Tyndall, that I was told by people who were connected to the Pulitzer Committee, that came close. That was in the top 5 or something like that for investigations. Prizes are a part of the business, but you don't think about them. You might think about it when you finally nailed everything. But wow, this is a hell of a story. I know we're gonna enter it into all these prizes. Maybe it's got a shot. That's impossible to predict. But on this story, we were just so, driven just to get it published that nothing else was, on our radar. Hope that answers.
Got time for a few more. In the back, yeah.
All right, so How's it going, Mr. Grimmett? My name is Clayton Signori. I broadcast journalism major here at Penn State. My question to you is there another story that you're more proud of to have broken? And if not, what is another story that holds a special place in your career that really changed your perspective on investigative journalism?
You know, it's really, I've been asked that before, and it's really tough. I mean, this was a very important story, and the Tyndall thing, again, we hope our stories will have an impact, will change things. And when you have something like the Tyndall settlements, all that money that went to these women who were victimized for all those years, that's real impact. So you could never, downplay that in terms of, this is why we're in the business, is to do stories like this. I think the Pugliafito story, but when we finally, took him down, and that might have saved lives. I mean, he had no concern at all for these young people he was providing drugs to. But I've had other stories over the years that didn't win awards, but I thought were really important. I investigated a big wildfire in LA, just on a hunch. It burned. It was at that time the largest fire in LA's history, and it resulted from major screw-ups by the Forest Service and other fire agencies. And again, I got no cooperation there. When I finally got those stories published, I had the support of my editors back then. This was some time ago. It led to real changes in how these fires are fought, and that had an impact. The corrupt labor union I investigated that sent the top guy to prison. I mean, this labor union represented poor people. This guy was stealing from poor people, so that's an impact. You got rid of him. You got somebody who was actually looking out for these union members. So any type of investigative story usually has that. It's really hard to rank them because they all feel great when you get them, when you pull them off and they have an impact, and then you're on to the next one.
And he's on to the next one now. I mean, your work, you just recently, I was looking at your recent stories by, and you had a blaze at which I want to get this right, a fire chief was allegedly drunk at the scene.
Oh yeah, I've been investigating the LA Fire Department. I got something coming on that, something more. And the National Guard, I and earlier a colleague and I investigated the National Guard leadership in California. Eventually got the top guy gone and several other generals. So yeah, those results or impact are important.
So I'm going to give you a quick follow-up.
If I may, yes. This is actually a very important question. As a Penn State alumni, what would you say your favorite ice cream flavor is?
He skipped the creamery stuff at the Inside Scoop.
But I think
He skipped the ice cream.
I'm sure it was vanilla.
Vanilla.
Yeah, I'm done. Maybe that makes me a vanilla person. Isn't that what it's known for? Just the basic?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
No, it was amazing.
Thank you.
Right here.
Hello. So from seeing early on, you're pointing how the cops were like not unhelpful, but just being intentionally obtuse and deceptive. How does that color your thoughts on cops now in stories?
Covering cops. When I started off, I would be able. My first job, that wasn't an internship. I covered. It was up in Ventura County, north of LA, and I was covering several things. You do that when you're starting out. And every morning I would stop at the local cop station to read the police reports, to read the blotter, And the watch commander would come out and we'd read it together. And I'd say, hey, this looks interesting. Can I get that report? And he'd show me the report. And I'd write a story about it. Those days are over. Because of police unions and some bad court decisions, it's become more and more difficult to get anything out of the cops in the form of a report. I've filed records requests for reports a year ago, 2 years ago, I still haven't received. So we're suing them all the time. We're suing the city now over my fire department suit. We threaten to sue them. It's been really tough because everybody wants to control the information. And police departments are always coming under fire for this or that. So the less information they could release, the better for them. And of course, we feel the opposite way because we're representing the public. So it's very difficult, and that's where it comes back to human sourcing. Again, most of our best stories, you can do a great story just based on records and documents. A lot of data journalism is fantastic, but these kinds of stories, where you're uncovering real wrongdoing, you have to have human beings somewhere in the mix.
We're getting close to the top of the hour here, and so I want to be respectful of your time and all that, and what we sort of pitch this session on. But we're going to take 2 more questions here and here. So, thanks.
So I remember you spoke about the wildfires and writing about them. I wanted to ask you about your breaking news story from the 2004 Pulitzer Prize
Mhm.
about the family having to leave Claremont.
Right.
When you're talking to families like that about an event that was tragic to them, how do you find a way to represent them that connects to them but also doesn't take away from your story?
Very good question, and it goes to the heart of what, you know, folks who went to journalism will learn. It's empathy. You know, you don't just go up to somebody and say, hey, I need this information. You have to build their trust. This is also very important in investigative stories. The toughest thing, and the most important thing to do quite often, is to earn the trust of this person you're getting information from. Because again, this could go badly for them, even on a breaking news story like that. As you suggested, you could portray them in a way that they don't like. And it just takes, again, you've got to put yourself in that person's shoes. You know, how would I feel if I was portrayed this way? And that was a tough story because it was a breaking news story, and these people were in the middle of a tragedy. And I had to write the thing on deadline. I had to come back from the fire. It was only write it, so it would have been very easy to, you know, do something that somebody didn't like. Luckily, I avoided that. But that again, it gets back to the human element. It's not just data and documents and records and emails. You got to go out there and you got to talk to people face to face and earn their trust, make them feel good about what you're doing. My rule is that my sources never get surprised. They're never going to go online someday and see that I did something that they didn't see coming, that I didn't tell them was coming. Sometimes you have to have a preliminary conversation with a source, not getting on the breaking news story, just to see if you're comfortable with each other. And sometimes it doesn't work out. And the more you do it, the easier it becomes. It's never easy, but you get better at it. But yeah, it's during my career I covered all these terrible things, plane crashes, and it's rough. In front of going up to people and it's not good.
Hey, Paul. My name is Luke Vargas. I'm a junior from New Orleans, Louisiana, and I'm actually a writer for the Collegian. You talked a lot about the industry right now and sort of the state of it. And I mean, what we hear all the time about shrinking newsrooms, and we're all young journalists. And honestly, we learn in class all the time that the outlook isn't great, or there's all these kind of bad things going on. What's your forecast on the industry of journalism now, and maybe give us a word of hope to close out?
Well, first of all, the last time I was in New Orleans, it was Katrina. I tend to go back though, more pleasant circumstances. I'm bullish on the industry. It's certainly changing. The news, I was chatting with some other folks here earlier that we still refer to print journalists because we publish a newspaper book world.
Because we type.
Yeah, we type, right. Well, you got to type even, But, print is becoming multimedia. And we are in tough shape when it comes to things like just basic daily coverage, investigative reporting, especially in smaller communities that don't have a big paper. And even in bigger communities, those big papers have shrunk. So there is, I would even call it a crisis. We have news deserts now. The Guild and other unions are trying to do something about that, even through legislation, funding. But overall, I think that's going to correct itself because of two things. Number one, people need this information just to conduct their lives. I mean, all these stories are aimed at people. And number two, people love stories. They love storytelling. Humans are like that. And these are all great stories. So I encourage everybody to go into journalism because that's what it's all about. It doesn't pay great, but eventually it might. As your career advances, there are new outlets popping up all the time. We have a pretty robust. In the United States, I believe there's 300 journalism nonprofits. Many of them specialize in investigative reporting. Some of them pay pretty well too. I know other people who are looking into starting more of those. We're going to see more of a foundation business model for journalism. But it's a hell of a job. I mean, it's very stressful. Well, investigative reporting is very stressful, and the stuff we talk about is stressful, tragedies. But it's great fun. It's like not having a job. That's why I became a journalist. I didn't want a real job. And for much of my career, they tried to make me a manager. You know, I was a manager for a while. As a bureau chief, that's kind of a sort of a manager, not really more of a player coach. And I resisted. I don't like going to meetings. I don't like working 9 to 5. I like going out, watching things, looking into things, and you get to sit down and write a story about it. That's not bad. Might not get rich, but what do a lot of rich people do? They have all the money in the world. They buy newspapers. And they love it. Our guy's a billionaire now. He loves it.
I just want to reiterate that, I just want to say how much I agree with that answer. And, you know, in being old, I get crabby old people. What's the state of journalism? Why even bother? And my answer is journalism isn't dying. It's just changing. It's just changing forms. And that has happened, by the way, since before the telegraph. But the telegraph was like the first major thing to make a change. So back in the 1840s, people were like, newspapers are dead, So it's always been, it was ever thus. But our traditional last question to guests is, do you have any advice for the aspiring journalists in the room?
Well, I hope some of the advice sort of came out of your questions, my answers to your questions. My advice is, go with your passion, and if you like this kind of work, do it. Don't worry about the economic forecast; those change too. And as you said, basically what's changing is the delivery system for what we do. That's going to continue. It might even accelerate, because there's always going to be a need for this type of for journalism, and these types of specialties within journalism. So if you feel good about it now, I would pursue it.
Let's give Paul a round of applause. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you very much. I love your questions. I'm happy to answer any more.